Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo! It is time to explore a road less traveled. The mighty Columbia River, as it stretches from Hermiston and Umatilla over to Portland. Some of us remember when there was a small highway that took all day and sometimes two to drive to Portland. Now we have a freeway and can easily do the drive in 8 or 9 hours. While we are driving the freeway, we look across to the Washington side and we see a small road over there. It is that road that we've been exploring during the last few episodes of A Road Less Traveled. We've had several great adventures. One was checking out Willamette Falls at Oregon City. What a beautiful falls it is. We enjoyed a lovely lunch at Hood River. From the dining room, we could see the bridge that we would be taking across the Columbia River to Washington. And we enjoyed the historic and interpretive signs that Washington has provided all along this road. They have great pullouts with some very interesting topics. For one thing, we learned about the phenomenal amount of shipping activity that goes both directions along the Columbia River. Barges, trains, and trucks. This is one very busy shipping corridor. As much as we enjoyed the turnouts, what we really enjoyed was just the great drive itself. This little Highway 14 meanders around. It gains high altitudes so you get big vistas. It dips down next to the river. It is a great drive. We ended our last adventure at Celilo Falls. Little did I know how important Celilo Falls had been for many, many thousands of years. In fact, Celilo Falls is the oldest continuously inhabited community on the North American continent. It was an Indian trade center for the entire West Coast. The community was inhabited for 15,000 years until 1957, when the Dalles Dam buried it under a man-made lake. The overlook at Celilo Falls is just a short ways from a small turnoff that winds down the hillside to a small town called Wishram. We didn't really expect to stop at Wishram, but who can resist a sign that looks like this? So, my friend Harold and I went on a little unexpected exploration. Wishram is a town of some 250 people. It was named from Fallbridge to Wishram in order to honor one of the tribes that live in this area. This large, well-cared-for steam engine gives us a hint as to a lot of the history of Wishram. It is obviously a railroad town, serving the Burlington Northern on the northern shore of the Columbia River. Union Pacific on the south shore does not run any Amtrak trains anymore since they took out the Pioneer route. But the Burlington Northern does run Amtrak. Hence, Wishram has what Boise doesn't, and that's Amtrak service. Here is their lovely station. And here's a photo I found on the internet of the station helping out local passengers. At the train station, there is this fine memorial dedicated to the memory of those dauntless pathfinders and pioneers who followed the great thoroughfare of the Columbia at this place. It is an impressive list that includes railroad men. I liked the town of Wishram itself, lovely little tree-filled town. And I particularly liked the old highway that was the road that went down to Wishram and then back up from Wishram to the modern highway. Back on Highway 14, we were once again up high on the hill, enjoying magnificent vistas. Among them was where the John Day River comes into Celilo Reservoir behind the John Day Dam. Once we were out of the canyon, we could see the many, many, many wind farms that have been built in this country. Your beer drinking guide shares with you a wee bit of an inspiration. This little wee epiphany happened when your beer drinking guide was talking in last week's show during a road less traveled. We stopped and looked over Celilo Falls, and he got to thinking about this one little reader board that talked about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Please note, your beer drinking guide sat down and made this recording before he met someone drinking a beer who told him how to pronounce Celilo Falls. So, here we have his epiphany. While I was making this tribute to the drive along the north side of the Columbia River, and particularly while I was telling the story about pulling into this little pullout where they look over the old Celilo Falls and they talk about the commerce that used to go on there and the Lewis and Clark exhibition, or expedition I guess it was, not an exhibition, I had a little epiphany, and it was really quite stunning, and I enjoyed it, so I thought I'd share. Before I do that, though, I would like to say, just how do you pronounce Celilo Falls? I went out looking for places that would show a diagram of how to pronounce the word, and I couldn't find any. So if I'm saying it completely wrong, well, I don't know. I guess you can sue me for everything I'm making off of this little episode. The epiphany that I had here, learning about Celilo Falls and the great trade center that it was when I was reading about when Lewis and Clark were here. Now, I have read the diary of Lewis and Clark. I had a great affinity with Lewis and Clark simply because their spelling is almost as bad as mine. So it took a little while to get to where I could read their diary. Not too long. I must admit, at least it was typewritten so I could make it out. Writing or reading my own notes, I very often look at them and think, well, I know I was trying to tell myself something, but I have no idea what it was. And the spelling doesn't help either. However, I do recommend that you read the Diary of Lewis and Clark. It really is a stunning read, and it really does make it so you appreciate what it was to spend 2 years out exploring this country that had had a few people walk through it, but hadn't really been explored. And of course, it had native peoples here for thousands of years. So I knew that they brought along supplies to trade. Of course, we have been trading with natives, since the Egyptians went out and found the Babylonians, and the Babylonians went out and found the Indians, and the Indians went out and found the Chinese, and the Chinese went out and found the Japanese. We've always said, hey, I've got salt, and you have that shiny, goldy stuff. I'll trade you some of my salt for some of your gold. I'll trade you some of my porcelain for some of your silks. I'll trade you some of my whatever you had. It's trade. It led to money, and it has come around to commerce. So you trade. What is of value to people? Well, I can see where shiny beads and things like that are of value to people because, if the only thing you have to make trinkets out of is shells, well, a glass bead is pretty impressive compared to that if you've never seen one. And so that would be a valuable thing to trade. So I got to reading what Lewis and Clark were trading, and I knew that they were trading, and however, I hadn't read a specific list. And of course, they carried all kinds of stuff, tobacco and everything else, I suppose. Whiskey was probably one of the favorites. Although I don't know if Lewis and Clark carried whiskey. That would be pretty heavy. In the list of things that they showed here at Salelo Falls, they listed the store of trade goods included beads, thimbles, ribbons, mirrors, buttons, and many other items. I can certainly see where a mirror, wow, a button, wow. What phenomenal things. As they went trading up the Missouri and then over the mountains and down the Columbia, Lewis and Clark would absolutely make a point of, well, if you like these, be nice to us, because we can bring you an unlimited supply of them. Where we're from, these are common. Well, the people of the Pacific Northwest have been trading, as we've seen, for years. They got shells from the Pacific Ocean, and they got buffalo hides from the plains, and they got different things. And so it was acceptable to them that, well, where you come from, you can bring these things. So it made sense to them to say, okay, we'll not bother you going down the river. And I got to thinking of a thimble. One of the things that Lewis and Clark were smart enough to bring along was a thimble. Something where is my camera? It must be around here somewhere. Something we take for granted, very lightweight. You could carry thousands of them. Something we take for granted, something I've taken for granted all my life. I know I've certainly taken them for granted all my life. This was one of my mother's thimbles. I probably did some, embroidery work with it when I was a kid, and it would fit any finger on my finger. These days it's gotten to where it fits this one. Another of my mom's thimbles was this one, and it barely fits my little finger anymore. Imagine what it was like, though, when Lewis and Clark sit down with these strangers, and they are very strange to the strangers. They're dressed differently. Which Indians, the native tribes were used to people dressing a little differently, but not as differently as these people did. Not with these stitched clothes, not with these, buttons and belts and things like that, other than sashes. So they sat down with these very, very odd-looking people, oddly dressed people, oddly colored people, a little uncomfortable because they'd never seen this sort before. And these people show them what they have to trade. And they say, really, we're not interested in stopping. We just are wanting to go down the river. Well, that's what people do when they're traveling. They just want to pass through. And they show what they have to offer in case they come back this way and want to trade. So they show these beads, and that's fancy, and they show different items that are probably quite different. Different tribes probably caught on to different things. But I can just see they're having no idea what these little silvery buckets are for. There's certainly, you couldn't carry enough water in them to make them practical. You know, really, there's not much of a use for such a thing. Until Lewis or Clark, trying to demonstrate the value of them, picks one up and puts it on his finger, and maybe picks up a twig or a stick or a pine needle that's laying there and uses it to push it through some material that he's wearing. Well, there might have been some ladies hanging around some of these meetings, in which case I think right then and there, from the ladies section, you would have heard, "Oh my God, I want that. You let these people through. In fact, you guide them down the river as long as they let us keep that." Because they would have instantly seen the value of such a thing. It's possible some of their meetings were in huts where there were no women folk. And I'm sure that a lot of the men were sensitive to the needs of their women. They loved their women like we all do. And I'm not sure, but once or twice a man might have been looking at that and kind of thought, well, what use is pushing a stick through some cloth? So maybe Lewis or Clark had to reach over and grab a piece of leather, a piece of cowhide, or, well, not cowhide, but deer hide or something, and take a bone, which people used to sew with back then, and use that. And one of the men looked at that and says, "Honey, get in here. I got something to show you." So his wife comes in, maybe a little shy, kind of, you know, she's around all these men and these very odd-looking people. And so she kind of comes in, not quite sure, and he says, come on. And he grabs her hand and he sticks this thing on it. And she's, what are you doing to me? And he sticks this thing on it, and he hands her a bone, and he hands her the hide, and he says, look, and points it at it, and she pushes it through, and she says, "Oh my God, I want that. I'm taking it. You show these guys down the river, and you show these guys the way back up the river, as long as they bring me more of these." Oh, I can just imagine. Once the principle was grasped, how absolutely phenomenal a thimble was for a trade item. While your beer drinking guide was coming up with this wee bit of inspiration, he did get to thinking about the natives. Now, the natives were using bones and sharp rocks to punch holes in leather and hides so that they could string things together and do other kinds of sewing. It only stands to reason that even before Lewis and Clark showed the natives of the Pacific Northwest steel thimbles, they must have been using tools to save their hands while they were shoving these pieces of bone and sharp rock through hides, which are pretty tough. It turns out that long before recorded history, humans were using different tools to push items through other items in order to make holes. In the Pacific Northwest, there is documentation of whalebone being used to protect hands while driving a sharp object through hides, as well as teeth from different animals that had been slaughtered. I suppose buffalo have some pretty big teeth. Your beer-drinking guide speculates that probably rocks and pieces of wood and anything handy was used for driving holes into hides. There really would have been no need to put them on your fingers. Probably they were held in the palm of the hand and pushed bones and pieces of rock with sharp edges. When it comes to thimbles that were made of metal that came from fired furnaces, the earliest example we've found came from Rome. It was a bronze thimble from the 1st century current era, and it was found in the ruins of Pompeii. Please note that my illustration here is not of that early bronze thimble, which I was unable to find a representation of. In English, thimbles were first called thumb bells. They were commonly worn on the thumb instead of the finger, perhaps because the thumb has more power for pushing primitive needles through rather more harsh materials than we have today. Also, originally, the top of the thimble was more of a mushroom shape, giving the name thumb bell. The dimples on thimbles, as any sewer knows, are to keep the pin from slipping around as you push on it. These dimples, before 1850, were hand punched, so the pattern on a thimble was irregular. In the 1850s, it was figured out how to make machinery that would punch the holes into the thimbles, and the patterns became reliable. Thimbles made before the pattern of the dimples was regular are highly prized by collectors. Thimbles have been made of pretty well every substance: brass, bronze, steel, iron, wood, glass, whalebone, leather, rubber, horn, ivory, marble, mother of pearl, diamonds, rubies, you name it. People have made thimbles out of it. During the 1800s, it became popular to make thimbles from silver. The only problem is silver is quite a soft metal, and by then we had steel needles that were quite pointed on the thread end. These steel needles would poke right through the soft silver. An English jeweler named Charles Horner solved the problem by lining these silver thimbles with a steel core. That way, ladies could still enjoy their fashionable silver thimbles without poking themselves with needles. Charles called his practical and decorative thimbles Dorcas. Needless to say, original Charles Horner Dorcas are also very highly prized by collectors. By the 1800s, thimbles had become so common that they became popular for many different uses. One of those was for measuring spirits. The natives had been right that this was far too small a bucket to be hauling water, but it was very handy for measuring fire water. The term, "oh, I'll just have a thimbleful," came from using thimbles as tumblers for measuring out hard alcohol. Another use that became popular for thimbles was called thimble knocking. Thimble knocking became popular for widely different reasons. Victorian schoolmistresses would walk up and down the aisles of classrooms, thumping noggins of bad students with her finger that was covered with a thimble. I'm sure it was quite effective. At the same time, ladies of a different sort were running around at night, tapping on windows to let their customers know they were available. Thimbles were real handy for protecting their delicate fingers. And, of course, for making a much better announcement on the window than their finger alone would have made. I am speculating that there was more than one bad boy who grew up to be glad that the thimble tappers were no longer using the thimble as they had back in school. Over the last few centuries, collecting thimbles has become quite a passionate hobby. Those who do such a thing are called digibalists. Folks, this is my 106th guide to the Great Wahoo. I really enjoy doing these. It's great coming up with the stories, what to tell, how to tell it, and find the research. However, they are very time-consuming, and I do have several things that just have to get done. Also, summertime is coming up, and I can think of better things to do in the summertime than sit at my computer. So I'm going to take a little hiatus. I still have my producer fees paid up, and they will continue to run reruns. They'll be rather random and unorganized, but that's how it is. It's been great fun. Check out my website, www.greatwahoo.com, anytime, and feel free to write to me at beerdrinker@greatwahoo.com. To finish this, the last Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo, at least for a while, let me honor Sir Winston Churchill. Few men have done better at living the Great Wahoo in a grand and large manner. In his great celebration of the Great Wahoo, Sir Winston understood many things. Otherwise, he could not have observed of another fellow human being. He has all the virtues I dislike, and none of the vices I admire. And that's this week's Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time. I probably will find some story to tell and come up with a random new Great Wahoo every once in a while. In the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.